Alrighty, and welcome, viewer. Uh, and as soon as I do that, I lose the thing. All right, welcome, viewer. If you hate the system and are thinking of bombing it, or you hate radical terrorists, this is a live stream for you. Ted Kaczynski was a maths professor turned Luddite whose failure resulted in his lashing out against the system, which he published a manifesto against and mailed 16 bombs against targets of industrialization, which we will be debating the merits of today. This follows on from our previous series of propaganda and political instability. So who are we? I'm Ben, a software engineer and founder of Bevry. I built software that is installed millions of times each month and created content on YouTube that has a year of view time now. I'm joined today by John, an autodidact philosopher and the screenwriter of The Antinatalist, which you can view on this channel. John also led our recent series exploring the Viveki's meaning crisis. And together, we are part of Bevry, an open company comprised of a study department, which includes this weekly show that uncovers objective truth, so we can keep our axioms aligned towards it. Bevry is also comprised of a build department, which develops projects and products that will further the expansion of collaborative wisdom. With that, I'm going to hand it over to John to intro the essay we will be discussing today, and then we'll get into a breakdown of the merits and the insanity of this manifesto by someone who is arguably brilliant and insane.
And just to clarify, I'm not debating in favor of the merits of bombing any any sorts of buildings or anything like that. I'm only interested in considering the central theses of the work of interest. All right, so the Industrial Society and Its Futures, the paper published by, I believe it was the New York Times, under sort of threat from Ted Kaczynski. I think it came with the criteria that need to be met is like publish this or else the bombings shall continue. So it's really interesting to think about. This is a work that has been written or is only being read due to the effects that he was putting out alongside it. So anyway, just for I guess a quick rundown of what the paper is. It's sort of a it's an impetus towards revolution. It's putting forward the problem of industrial society, the effects that technology and has this sort of like building up ever increasing amount, and to the point that it infiltrates onto people's lives and their ability to find meaning in their lives and to be happy, to the point that in order for people to continue in such societies, they would have to be molded and become essentially cogs in the gigantic technological industrial system, or to reject it and to rebel against it and burn it to the ground, essentially. And so that's his sort of thesis, as well as some arguments against how a reformation of the technology would be unlikely to work in order to fix the sort of problems that he's raising in this. And so that's why it's ultimately, a propaganda piece for this sort of like anarcho naturalist sort of cultish, or not necessarily cultish, but at least some sort of group trying to deconstruct the industrial society or technological society that we have right now.
Yeah. Perfect. So neither of us are necessarily, well, I don't think either of us are saying we should result into domestic terrorism. But it's more, he has some interesting criticisms of society. My personal stance is the first 5 pages of this is actually very profound. Some of his insights, like it's a mix between profoundness and just unsoundness. Like about maybe, the first 5 pages, very insightful. But then it just gets more dubious, the justifications for his arguments from then on. Now, it's important to state the paper was written in 1995. This is the year the World Wide Web went online with Windows 95, pretty much. And, you know, there was earlier versions of it, but really when it hit mainstream was 1995. And it was still through the dial-up modems, the ones that went do 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 do. And it is a bit nostalgic back then. Like for the millennials, like the world back then was, you know, it was kind of like the Friends TV show to an extent, which if you watch it as an adult, you realize this is just a liberal propaganda piece to justify like loose relationships against conservatism to an extent. But outside of that, yeah, it's a time where we didn't have this global connection that we do now. And he really was concerned about the direction things was having, because at the same time, you had this history of the 20th century, the 1900s to the year 2000, where the world went from a series of major catastrophes from political ideology as well as economical causes, which he would then portray to be resultant of technology, to then more and more devastation throughout, or political instability from the 70s onwards, which we covered in our political instability talk. So it was a very jaded time. I think he comes from the Beat generation, which is also very similar to, who was the author? I can't remember. It was something I was researching a while ago, but these are the times of like Hell's Angels, kids who kind of don't know where they fit in, a lot of political angst, you know, the hippie generation, a lot of feelings of society is getting larger than them and how do they fit in. At the same time, there was lots of concerns. You had things like Roswell, you had things like assassinations, you had like of presidents, you had things like the CIA and drug testing and LSD became popular. You had the war on drugs subsequently. So you had a lot of, and I guess Bob Dylan was also a influencer here. At the same time, you have companies like Apple and Microsoft kind of taking over. And you then had things like logging and destruction of society to kind of fuel this city life cycle that was kind of causing this mass immigration into cities over rural areas.
Right.
So there's a lot
yeah, and around that time you can definitely see a lot of angst even just within the popular culture of the time, like especially in the late 90s. You have like 3 like huge blockbusters, or at least 2 huge blockbusters. I'm not sure how much but like Office Space, that's one with like very much this sort of sense of angst within the sort of corporate America that one has to live within. It's a comedy. You also have works like The Matrix that sort of features that at the beginning with him and his job, as well as Fight Club, especially. That's probably the most significant one, which you can kind of see a lot of inspirations of Fight Club from this, I'd say.
Yeah, essentially Brad Pitt's character inside Fight Club is probably the manifestation of this manifesto. That movie is essentially what we're doing in this live stream, but they're doing it more dramatically, which is a testing ground, a novel testing ground of the ideas, which is why we chose to use one of the scenes of it in the thumbnail.
All right, before we start and sort of go into each of the sections and sort of like our thoughts and critiques of those sections, I'd like to announce that we have started a secondary channel that is, well, it's not even like secondary to this, but sort of its own particular focus that it has, called Bevry Readings. We'll have probably a link to it down below. What it's going to be is a collaborative sort of channel for people to read and record different papers that they find of interest or would like to put out there for others to listen to and glean from. that will be posted up onto the channel for all to benefit from. It's primarily, just so long. Anybody is welcome to make additions to it. So far, I had 2 videos from C.M. Bradley, who's read the Jordan Peterson papers, and I read a paper from John Searle right there currently. What we plan to do is put out at least one audio recording of a paper or an article or Wikipedia page, blog post even, if it's important or of interest out there, and hopefully do that like at least one a week. And then that way it'll be a public resource for anybody that just doesn't have the time or the attention span or even the ability to read these papers. And now it sort of provides them a way in which they can still benefit from them. So
great. And you've read a lot more about Ted's life, right? Maybe just give a brief overview of the trajectory.
Okay. I mean, I didn't read much. I sort of skimmed through the Wikipedia article. I did listen to a sort of interview from a philosopher that sort of has collaborated with Ted Kaczynski, even in jail, to write a book with, and like it's sort of a series of their letters. That I found that pretty fascinating. I think it was I'll just share the title of it. David Skirbina on Ted Kaczynski, Technological Slavery and the Future of Our Species. That's on the Manifold channel, episode 7. But anyway, that's sort of the background that I have. But I don't know. You probably, either one of us could probably just sort of share what we read from the Wikipedia page.
Yeah. So he's pretty much a gifted child who it seems many people have suspected he has autism, one from his ways he's dealt with socializing. He was described as a recluse, but he also had a situation, he had very extreme things happen to his life, which is probably why he became an extremist. And so, for instance, he had a severe case of hives, and then he kind of became apathetic and depersonalized for quite a while, for months.
Well, this was while he was very young, like a baby, I think. So
yeah, and then after that, and then he went to see physicians, and he hated it. They would hold him down, very similar to what we now know of how mental health was conducted back then. There was a brilliant game called The Town of Light, like that went into this idea of lobotomies. So for instance, if you were mad, you were a problem to society, and the solution was to fix that problem. And one of the ways would be to stick a needle through your nose to obliterate your frontal cortex. Absolutely horrific. Like the idea that the system or society has the right to rehabilitate yourself to be a docile participant in society was quite large in the early 20th century. Fortunately, now it's illegal. But it's very similar to the movie by which starred Jack Nicholson. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest type treatment, just to bring up the imagery of what he may have faced. So he did an IQ test. He scored 167, which is far above average. It's not in the hugely upper tiers, but it would probably put him in perhaps the data science category of jobs today if he was in the workforce today. Now, neighbors that are done, but he was described as civically minded. He went into academia, became a mathematician. So he did seem to have this left-leaning thing, which he then somewhat rallies against. A typical academic, a typical civic mindedness, a typical resentment of the system, which he elaborates a lot more because his essay is very, very, what do you call it?
Kind of a full
intricate in its connections. that it makes. But one of the most fascinating things is during Harvard, which he was able to skip into quite early, this section. As a sophomore, Kaczynski participated in a study described by author Alston Chase as a purposely brutalizing psychological experiment led by Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. Subjects were told they would be debating personal philosophy with a fellow student and were asked to write essays detailing their personal experiences, personal beliefs and aspirations. The essays were turned over to an anonymous attorney who in later session would confront and belittle the subject, making vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive attacks. Using the content of the essays as ammunition, while electrodes monitored the subject's psychological reactions. These encounters were filmed, and subjects expressed anger and rage were later played back to them repeatedly. The experiment lasted 3 years, with someone verbally abusing and humiliating Kaczynski each week. Kaczynski spent 200 hours as part of the study. Kaczynski lawyers later attributed this hostility towards mind control techniques to his participation in Murray's study. Some sources have suggested that Murray's experiments were part of Project MKUltra, the Central Intelligence Agency's research into mind control. Chase and others have also suggested that this experience may have motivated Kaczynski's criminal activities. There's actually a good film from the 90s, I believe it was, maybe even earlier, that looked into the CIA's or the USA government's experiments in mind control. There was many psychological experiments as well as pharmaceutical experiments that did occur. Some horror movies that go into that. They tested drugs in military units that resulted in horrendous psychological damage and real life crimes. It was not a good time to be on the end of these experiments. Essentially, it was vivisection for the human animal rather than just the monkeys, and the rats that we do it on today. So humans were lab rats back then. All right, so onwards, this is when we can see some extreme things occurred, and he also became increasingly threatened or felt threatened by technology. He kind of did a Walden. He went to the woods, lived there for several years, I think 6 or so. And then certain issues again occurred with the system where he felt it was now unsustainable to practice that way of life.
Right.
And that
even sort of retreating from society was still coming in and messing things up for him to the point that he couldn't even live happily enough on his own there.
Right. So. And that's kind of then immediately, so he started his manifesto and started his campaign bombing actually during his time in the cabin. So while he was in the cabin, he more or less commenced his radicalization. And then with the threat of the cabin, he then enacted on that radicalization. And his first campaign really was to get this manifesto published to as many people as possible. But in the manifesto, he does discuss that you need to kill to get publicity if you wish to start a revolution. And he considered himself a revolutionary. But his whole goal was, if the revolution isn't taken up by a significant amount of people, then it makes no impact at all. So his goal was create as much publicity as possible through radical acts to get the manifesto in people to then fuel more radical acts to take down the technological system. Right. And the manifesto is his reasoning in that. In the same way, we have the manifesto by the Christchurch shooter. These are, if you're generally a radical, you want to make sure your arguments are sound and justify your actions. However, unfortunately, a lot of the radicals we've seen radicalize before they seek feedback on their manifesto, which is a little bit peculiar. But at the same time, with his distrust and personal experiences, that may make sense. He's already cemented in himself this resentment. All right. So now that we've covered that, John, do you have anything to add? Otherwise, we'll jump straight into it.
No, yeah, we'll jump right in. Each section is sort of, they build up from each other. So I'll just sort of say what section I'm on, and then some like choice highlights from the section. I'll just read them over to sort of give the audience a bit of a look into this, just to sort of understand what we're discussing here. So yeah, introduction. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. They have greatly increased the life expectancy of those of us who live in advanced societies, but they have destabilized society, have made life unfulfilling, have subjected human beings to indignities, have led to widespread psychological suffering, in the third world to physical suffering as well, and have inflicted severe damage on the natural world. It's sort of a basic sort of starting off point. Yep. Further down in proposition 2,
I think maybe we should continue down to the chapter 4, just until the end of chapter 4, because that summarizes.
If we do that, we're gonna be here all day. Because
no. Sorry, I mean paragraph 4.
Yeah, I know. Okay. If people want to read the full thing, they can do so on their own terms. We're just going through the main highlights to sort of discuss. All right. In 2, and only at the cost of permanently reducing human beings and merely, if it survives. Okay, so 2, the industrial technological system may survive or it may break down. If it survives, it may eventually achieve a low level of physical and psychological suffering, but only after passing through a long and very painful period of adjustment, and only at the cost of permanently reducing human beings and many other living organisms to engineered products and mere cogs in the social machine. So that's sort of his argument that if the industrial technological system continues, it's going to continue to build upon itself to the point that it will have to adapt human nature to such a point that all it is a mere cog to the social machine. And in the paper, he elaborates how it's doing so currently as well. All right, 3, if the system breaks down, the consequences will still be very painful, but the bigger the system grows, the more disastrous the results of its breakdown will be. So if it is to break down, had best break down sooner rather than later. Therefore, we advocate a revolution against the industrial system. So that's kind of making his case for, and further in the paper, for why we need to harbor a revolution against this system, because it's going to build up to such a point that it's going to either wipe out human existence or convert humans' existence to mere cogs in the machine, such that they would not be even recognizable from what they are currently. And so, yeah, the advocation of revolution. So that's the introduction. Do you want to sort of lay out your thoughts?
Yeah. So, well, the reason why I think 1 to 4 is good, just because this is the real thing of why he's rallying against technology, which is the continued development of technology will worsen the situation. It will subsequently subject human beings to greater indignities and inflict greater damage on the natural world. It will probably lead to a greater social disruption and psychological suffering. It may lead to increased physical suffering in advanced countries. So this is his hypothesis, right? Mm-hmm. Or his conjecture. And then that then says, there is no way of reforming or modifying the system so as to prevent it from depriving people of dignity, autonomy. And therefore, if it is to break down, we should break it down sooner. So it's this idea that technology only, it's not really only makes things worse, but his feeling is, let's go through the highlights as it goes, because he starts off like his justification. This is the whole, like, what would you call it? The foundation
central
of
thesis,
it, right?
Yeah,
central thesis.
He elaborates
right?
reasons.
Yeah. So he justifies it first with a large critique of leftism is through this. And this is where, to some extent, his insights I find a little bit profound, although I'm not saying they are true or entirely true. I'm just saying that they are unique, novel, and interesting. And that's how I'm attributing profound. So he states that leftism has two psychological tendencies: feeling of inferiority and over-socialization. So feelings of inferiority, these can be things like low self-esteem, feelings of powerlessness, depressive tendencies, defeatism, guilt, self-hatred. And then he talks about many things which we've heard about throughout 2006 onwards, that have been brought to the modern public consciousness, such as political correctness. Things issue with this. The idea that when someone interprets as derogatory almost anything that is said about him or about groups with whom he identifies, we can conclude, so this is what he's saying, we conclude that he has inferiority feelings of low self-esteem. He then talks about how certain words, for instance, like such as Oriental, these actually have no derogatory connotations. Instead, the negative connotations have been attached to these terms by the activists themselves. And we can see this. For instance, Americans have an issue with the word Oriental. People in the East do not. Why do Americans have it? Because they have a negative feeling about the Vietnam War. And therefore they project that, bundle it into the word. It's many issues with a lot of these words. Negro, why is this offensive? Because of the American Civil War. There is things within the culture that then infiltrates these words. And it's very similar with Gone for the Wind. Gone for the Wind has now been disowned from HBO, the movie. And why? Because people have projected racism onto the movie. They projected a thesis into the movie that wasn't there. And even the movie actually, you can watch that if you're not part of America, and you can see, hey, the movie isn't the entire story. It never claimed to be the entire story. In fact, there's a few sentences in it that say that it wasn't nice for the slaves. Many fled when the Civil War ended. Not everyone was docile. So you have people projecting on their own morality onto others. Political correctness has its stronghold among university professors who have secure employment with comfortable salaries, and the majority of whom are heterosexual white males from middle to upper middle class families. This is well that Terry knows as a maths professor. Many leftists have an intense identification with the problems of groups that have an image of being weak, defeated, repellent, or otherwise inferior. The leftists themselves feel that these groups are inferior. They would never admit it to themselves that they have such feelings, but it is precisely because they do see these groups as inferior that they identify with their problems. Clearly, they are nagged. So another example of this, clearly they are nagged by the fear that women may not be as strong as capable as men. So leftists tend to hate anything that has an image of being strong, good, and successful. They hate America, they hate Western civilization, they hate white males, they hate rationality. Thus, it is clear these faults are not with the leftist real motive. So he hates America and the West because they are strong and successful. Words like self-confidence, self-reliance, initiative, enterprise, optimism, etc. play little role in the liberal and leftist vocabulary. The leftist is anti-individualistic, pro-collectivist. He wants society to solve everyone's problems for them, satisfy everyone's needs for them, and take care of them. He is not the sort of person who has an inner sense of confidence in his ability to solve his own problems and satisfy his own needs. The leftist is antagonistic to the concept of competition because deep inside he feels like a loser. And onward, we say modern leftist philosophers tend, he says, modern leftist philosophers tend to dismiss reason, science, objective reality, and insist that everything is culturally relative. They are deeply involved emotionally in their attack on truth and reality. They attack these concepts because of their own psychological needs. It satisfies the drive of power. We'll get into that in the next bit. The leftist feelings of inferiority run so deep that he cannot tolerate any classification of some things as successful or superior and other things as failed or inferior. So another popular one in modern political philosophy, leftists are antagonistic to genetic explanations of human abilities or behavior because such explanations tend to make some persons appear superior or inferior to others. Leftists prefer to give society the credit or blame for an individual's ability or lack of it. Thus, if a person is inferior, it is not his fault, but society's, because he has not been brought up properly. What was my note? Maturation. Alrighty, so ingrained, so his feelings of inferiority are so ingrained that he cannot conceive of himself individually as strong and valuable. Hence the collectivism of the leftists, he can feel strong only as a member of a large organization or a mass movement with which he identifies himself. Notice the masochistic tendency of leftist tactics, so martyrdom, and also the self-hatred. So lying down in front of vehicles, chaining themselves to trees, provoking police and racists to abuse them. Or for instance, even becoming like a martyr would be one. So his hostility is too prominent a component of leftist behavior, so is the drive of power. Moreover, much leftist behavior is not radically calculated to be of benefit to the people whom the leftists claim to be trying to help. Leftist activists do not take such an approach because it would not satisfy their, So why aren't they peaceful? Because it doesn't satisfy their emotional needs. So another instance, race problems serve as an excuse for them to express their own hostility and frustrated need of power. All right, so why does this occur? Well, he then says like these feelings of inferiority, shame, and guilt, self-hatred, defeatism, right? Well, they occur within the leftists because they've been over-socialized. So the role of a normal socialization is to designate the process by which children are trained to think and act as society demands. How well you fit into the puzzle. For instance, I've met many Canadians and they think Canada is great. But then is it great for an ISIS member? Is it great for, a minority that doesn't fit within the system? Is Canada really the greatest, or USA, or whatever Western country we portrayed? Well, it's always great for the privileged, right? It's not great for those outside. And this is where self-governance plays a role, largely because we want to organize society around where everyone can fit in, not just the privileged. So socialization is this way of getting individuals to fit within the demands of society, fit within, and he would then say that the demands of society changes as technology changes, because as one adopts technology, there is far-reaching consequences on society that then necessitate more and more technology. He then goes into, say, genetic engineering as like a long-form concern, or in terms of just immediate ways, such as telephone lines. Well, if you want to have telephone communication, which seems to be a great initiative and benefit to society, well, then you need telephone lines, you need electricity, you need all sorts of other things to facilitate this communication. But what is over-socialization? So the moral code of us, what's my little note here? Okay, I've got America. So the moral code of our society is so demanding that no one can think, feel, or act in completely moral way. For example, we are not supposed to hate anyone, yet almost everyone hates somebody at some time or other, whether he admits it to himself or not. Some people are so highly socialized that the attempt to think, feel, and act morally imposes severe burden on them. In order to avoid feelings of guilt, they continually have to deceive themselves about their own motives and find moral explanations of feelings and actions that in reality have a non-normal origin. We use the term over-socialized to describe such people. Over-socialization can lead to low self-esteem, a sense of powerlessness, defeatism, guilt. One of the most important means by which our society socializes children is by making them feel ashamed of behavior or speech that is contrary to society's expectations. If this is overdone, or if a particular child is especially susceptible to such feelings, he ends up feeling ashamed and hates himself. So I've got the note here, Brené Brown. Why? Because unlike America, Australia doesn't seem to have this over-socialization issue. America seems to very much care about politeness, perhaps because the majority of immigrants to the USA were German, and German are very much about social order in the society, whether that is genetic or cultural, who knows. right? But like a large sizable amount of immigrants to the early USA were German, when in Australia it was convicts. So again, we have different cultural factors. So it was very confusing to me to often find within, say, different cultures, like such as watching Japanese cinema or watching American cinema, this need to appeal to this idea of society. And many people in America, they will be insincere to be polite. How that makes any sense to me, I do not know. They will say things such as, "It was so great to meet you," and yet they won't exchange phone numbers, right? So there's all of these things which you should say, but you don't actually mean, because you have this image of being polite.
And this are just like, "Get fucked, cunt."
Yeah, maybe not to the accent, but it's but maybe if an American needs to think that way. But yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? So so this goes a lot into the fears of 1984 and Brave New World. The over-socialized person cannot even experience without guilt thoughts or feelings that are contrary to the accepted morality. He cannot even think unclean thoughts. Thus, the over-socialized person is kept on a psychological leash and spends his life running on rails that society has laid down for him. In many over-socialized people, this results in a sense of constraint and powerlessness that can be a severe hardship, which suggests that over-socialization is among the serious cruelties that human beings inflict on one another. All right, what is my note here if it's going to actually enable me to see the goddamn note? Okay, trichotillomania. So this... Yeah.
What were you meaning with your past notes of Brene Brown? That I didn't get.
Great. Yeah. So I read several Brene Brown books because I watched a TED Talk and I'm like, this is brilliant. She's talking about shame and overcoming shame. And to tie into that note of trichotillomania, so something I've personally suffered with is compulsive hair pulling. There will be times in my life when I am stressed. I felt as if I've lost agency over my life. And as a form of like self-harm or self-hatred, similar to cutting or similar to, cutting is probably the easiest one. Easiest association. I would rip out my hair compulsively. It's a way of, biologically, it's a way of, what would you call it? Normalizing the parasympathetic nervous system, because there is the tension, pain, release. So your body is worked up with anxiety. It's on fight or flight. It needs some type of regulation to calm down, but your enemy is artificial. It's within your mind. It's very similar to the movie Babadook. You've lost control of your life. You can only turn inward and hate yourself for your insufficiencies. And the solution that I've come to find, which you can see from my lovely hair now, is to reclaim agency and never let another person take my agency away. And this is actually something that's interesting because a lot of his insights here are incredibly profound, and they've gone on to become incredibly impactful to even say modern business culture. So for instance, I've been reading a lot about, founding companies and business management because I'm running Bevry. And a lot of that, like for instance, agile business development philosophy is deliberately designed to, I'm still on screen sharing mode. It's deliberately designed to return autonomy and meaning to the people, involve them in the business's decisions, involve them in the meaning and the consequences of their work and the choice of how they wish to achieve it. So they're not just a cog in the machine. They actually feel they have agency over their contributions in the life and how they fit in. Because a lot of industrialized society, which is what he's rallying against, is old school factory worker or the cubicle worker, the accountant who just told, do these numbers. You have no part in the creative process. You are just a cog in the machine. We're just using you as a brain in a vat. And this is depriving. There is no agency. There is no experience in this. So it's no wonder that modern companies such as Google, such as Apple, such as many of the larger corporations have moved towards business management philosophies over the last 20 years that incorporate a sense of autonomy in its workforce, and have tried to bring this culture to the forefront, much to the probably disappointment or frustration, or perhaps hopefully humility of the author of this manifesto. But that is the case. So for instance, when I read something by Brené Brown, I put her in the meme of basic bitch, because I watched her talk on shame, her TED talk, and I'm like, this is amazing, talking about this feeling of shame that I felt, of, you know, pulling your hair, it's your own fault, you're an idiot for doing it, why would you just not stop, right? There's all this baggage related to that, right? You're doing it to yourself, just stop doing it, right? It's incredibly shameful. And I watched it, and then years later, I decided to read her books. And that was an incredibly frustrating experience, as frustrating as reading this manifesto, where her whole thing was just a triad of thoughts of how to pander to over-socialize individuals to then say, you can reclaim some of your agency by whatever it is, right? And I have a more detailed review on Goodreads that goes into my more articulate thoughts. But my whole thing for her is, you wouldn't have to do all these workarounds if you were just honest and transparent. But again, as an Australian, honesty and transparency and sincerity may be something I'm taking for granted culturally, right? If you're in a culture that is overly socialized, maybe being sincere makes you a social outcast. It certainly has me in my relationship with many Americans. So maybe her one is a way of bridging the gap for people who are excessively high on agreeableness and neuroticism, and have these particular sufferings. And when for me, I would just say, grow up, stop thinking about what other people think, be sincere, and you'll overcome all this nonsense that you're flustered about. But yeah, so that's my little point there. It's similar to when we watch Japanese cinema. We have a great thing on Peterson's wisdom in Eastern cinema, where many cases when you're watching a Japanese movie, for instance, the movie 5 centimeters per second by Makoto Shinkai, the characters constantly sacrifice love for their career. This is unheard of in a Western society. It's like, why don't you just tell them how you feel? Love is important. La da 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 da, and it's just like, no. There, it's selfish and a silly idea. So it's kind of interesting to think of the context of cultural consequences.
Yeah.
And this is part of his rallying cry. Yep, John.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, it seems like very much so that it's the case that the more Asian cultures, such as Japanese culture or Chinese culture, is like highly over socialized, where every individual is like has to be part of society, and like there's some benefits to that, I'm sure as well, like very little crime that takes place, and I'm sure very stable society, but it lacks the individuality that maybe American ideology sort of overemphasizes, or Australian ideology does, and it's trying to find where those actually can meet together without coming in complete conflict with each other.
Right. And yeah, and it's fascinating. That's something I could ramble on for a very long time, just because of my own overcomings. Yeah, so search, if anyone's interested in that further, my review of Brené Brown's book, but also my core question of how to overcome trichotillomania. I go into this topic in great detail. All right, so generally speaking, the goals of today's left is not in conflict with the accepted morality. On the contrary, the left takes an accepted moral principle, adopts it as their own, and then accuses mainstream society of violating the principles. So examples: racial equality, equality of sexes, helping poor people, peace, oppose the war, non-violence, generally freedom of expression, kindness to animals. Yeah, so, and sorry, I missed out this part. So leftists tend to be intellectuals and members of the upper middle class. Whereas the university intellectuals, highly socialized segment, left-wing segment, things he's talking more about. More fundamentally, the duty of so one of the beliefs, the duty of the individual is to serve society, and the duty of society is to take care of the individual. All these have been deeply rooted values in our society. So we're starting to see the introduction of the enemy. These are the orange highlights, and the power process. Who is the enemy he is now rallying against? And he's putting it as the bourgeoisie. They are the enemy, but also because they manifest a allegiance towards the industrial technical society. And he's not just against, so he's not specifically against industrial society per se. He's against, he draws the line at industrial technological society. But it's weird because where do you draw the line of technology? He draws the, like, for instance, later on, refrigerators, don't need refrigerators. They're beyond the line. They're crossing the line of refrigerators. But for instance, what about blacksmiths? What about your oven? What about things? So he specifically aligns with things of primitive society, but he doesn't go into where he draws the line for primitive society. And this is one of my contentions, which we'll get into. But I have here, So the leftists will reply, the last thing they want is to make the black man into a copy of the white man. Instead, they want to preserve African-American culture. But in what does this preservation of African-American culture consist? It can hardly consist in anything more than eating black-style food, listening to black-style music, wearing black-style clothing, and going to black-style church and mosque. In other words, it can express itself it can only express itself in superficial matters. In all essential respects, most leftists of the over-socialized type want to make the black man conform to white middle-class ideals. They want to make him study technical subjects, become an executive or a scientist, spend his life climbing the status ladder to prove that black people are good as white. They want to make black fathers responsible. They want black gangs to become nonviolent. But these are exactly the same values of an industrial technological system. The system couldn't care less what kind of music a man listens to, what kind of clothes he wears, or what religion he believes in. As long as he studies in school, holds a respectable job, climbs the status ladder, is a responsible parent, is nonviolent, and so forth. In effect, however much he may deny it, the over-socialized leftist wants to integrate the black man into the system and make him adopt his values. All right, this took me a long time to figure out. I spent most of my time on this section here because this is a conflation. Like it seems paradoxical. Like if they're trying to maintain black society, well, wouldn't that mean that black people should only listen to these? That's what he's proclaiming. But then he goes on to say the exact opposite. The black man should become like the white man. And there's a great book called The Invisible Man. This was one of the recommended reading by the guy who made The Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht. It's a fantastic book. It was, I also read it along with the book, The Man Who Wouldn't Stand Up. In it, they use the word niggardly, and they also use the word cracker or tool. And it was interesting because the way that these words are used are not racial. It is to be a tool of a system. And that is why the word niggardly is offensive back then. Or that's the meaning, which is if you're a nigger, you're a tool of the system. And the system there is the white man's system, or whatever system you're using it to insert derogatory action. So for instance, in The Man Who Wouldn't Stand Up, he calls a priest who is participating in this leftist over-socialization a nigger. And as a way of saying you are just the tool of the system, you don't even have any independent thought. And at the same time, The Man Who Wouldn't Stand Up the Invisible Man is about a black man who has a lot of social pressures to find himself as a human. And he talks about how he kept being considered a nigger when he went into white man's culture. This is post-slavery, like the early, like after Civil War, like say 1930s or something like that, right? And that's weird. And the reason why is because he's now becoming a tool of the system, this bourgeoisie system. And he's not meant to do that. He's meant to retain his culture. So it's a battle within someone, again, to claim their agency, to know that they're doing it for themselves. So how does this all fit together? Well, there was the feelings of inferiority, but also this feeling of over-socialization. Then we have the power process. I've summarized this in this note. So this is how I feel he's categorizing a leftist. Because I am ashamed of my own inferiority, I blame society for not being as virtuous as I. I resent inferiority as I resent myself. As I cannot overcome this, I can either make everything morally relative, which I don't actually believe, because then my activism won't be a foil for my shame. Or I can try and make society conform to myself. I can rid minorities of the likeness and conform them to myself because I despise them. That is the only way I can finally judge myself as moral. If everyone conforms to me, it validates my virtue. Hence why I tend towards authoritarianism. I am not recognizable or valid unless I am in a group, and I am not virtuous unless my group is supreme. And so I think that this is a major theme through how I think he's gone through the book. John, would you agree with that's his assessment of leftism?
He definitely brings up that like self-hatred is a leftist trait in Proposition 20. And I don't know if all of that quite works because there's the element there of well, the inner psychologization of the leftist, which I mean he brings up, but I don't know if like even the leftists would recognize that within themselves. Let's see a second. Yeah, there's certainly aspects of that seem in line with his reading of the leftists.
Right. All right. Well, let's keep that in mind as we progress forward. That's like the biggest, I guess, revelation I had.
I will say that, like, as I was reading through this, I was having a sort of a hard time understanding why this whole section was even included in the paper. Because at first I was suspecting that, oh, the leftists that he's sort of bringing up here are sort of the boogeymen for the whole revolutionary ideology. That these are like who we can pin all blame upon, and these are the outgroup, the enemy that we're supposed to be fighting. But as you go through the paper, it doesn't really apply to the leftists at all. Really, the boogeyman is more so this amorphous system that's sort of working unfoundedly. And there was a point in there where it seems like he's saying, oh, the leftists are sort of like the dupes of the system because they're just trying to make the black men to be part of the industrial technological system. But it didn't make much sense to me until I got to the later portion of strategy. And he brings up how for most revolutions that take place, they take place with leftists. And leftists are the ones that either are joining into the system or are the ones that sort of found it. But he points out how the leftist revolutions are horrible. I mean, they don't actually achieve what they intend to achieve. And because of this sort of leftist psychology of wanting to just keep on making the world more moral and like inventing new problems within whatever society, like everything's always a problem, no matter what sort of society it is. Like even if in today's society where you have the greatest amount of inclusion and equality between sexes and races and all of that, now like the leftist outcry is sort of at its highest point. And so like he recognizes that in order for this revolution to really take place, you cannot include any sort of leftists inside your revolution because they're just going to try to overturn it for their own gains and then just try to usurp it, because the aspect and the globalization of technology is a tool that the leftists can utilize in order to make the world more moral according to their understanding of how people should and shouldn't be. And so
right.
I think his reasoning for having such a large portion of this paper really attacking leftists in a really like deep and personal way, like attacking their own psychology and all of that, is because he doesn't want his movement to have any sort of association with leftists. And so while I don't think they're really the enemy of the movement, he is making a clear point. They're not going to be the friends of it. And so do not even try to
Right.
take, and that's the thing, because he sort of, a lot of his motivations are from sort of agriculturally, like that sort of like care for the environment and all that. That is something that would normally bring in a lot of like, be a shared motivation with a lot of leftists. But in order to sort of curtail that from happening, and maybe even like, I don't know, it seems like his like choice participants to his movement is just sort of condensing that into a much smaller potential base by doing so. But I mean, it makes sense why he is. I don't know if he'll be able to. That's the thing. In order for him to actually get a large enough movement, there would have to be enough people that share his hatred of the way that modern society has degraded man. And as of right now, that is just not out there.
Right. Yeah. So I think the reason why he's spent so long is, again, this is what the first 5 pages I would put as the most profound part, and the rest I find incredibly dubious. So he started off very, very strong. And why is it strong? Because it analyzes correctly a problem. And I'm not to say that's the correct interpretation of leftism or the entire, right? And he doesn't say it is either. He does constrain that, right? But it is something. And he has a lot of things that are very pronounced even today. But what's interesting, again, is like these chapter titles or these many things. So he has, okay, the leftist is someone who has this balancing of inferiority and over-socialization. This over-socialization is this controlling force that is projected onto others to protect them from feelings of inferiority, right? And then we can see why he then moves on to, well, why? Why is this the case? And then we get directly into the power process. Well,
Right.
Why do they start feeling inferior? And he says, what's the power process? So what is the power process?
Before we get into the power process, we have Submit in the chat. He had a question regarding like the leftist attempt to socialize. I guess that could be the way. To socialize the black man into the sort of larger group or the society. So Submit was asking, how is black folks learning science imply them embracing white values? I don't get how white folks have a copyright on science.
So then, okay, Matt, and as Submit has said, man of all races can wonder and do wonder how the universe works. Yeah, I'm bothered by this even today. I keep hearing this kind of language from today's leftists, right? So this is, he covers this actually through his rallying against science. And myself and John have different interpretations of how Terry's communicated this. I'll state mine, but we'll go into it.
It's Theodore or Ted. It's not Terry.
Yeah, I keep calling him Terry because Theodore just seems to shorten to Terry, in my opinion. There's an R in Theodore. Like, where's the, like...
I think Terry is short for Terrence.
There's 2 R's in Theodore, and there's only 1 D in Theodore. Shouldn't we prioritize the... Anyway, it is Ted. I have used Terry. If I'm using Terry, I mean Ted. Thanks, John, for elucidating the audience on my conflation. So he rallies against, so at least for the works I talked about of science of progress or things like this. And he does communicate this in some of the parts I've underlined, but I haven't communicated in the live stream due to respect of time. But the point is that science is a system that, for an extent, or its intended purpose is to provide objectivity. But with objectivity, you then say these things are superior and inferior. And the whole notion of some things being better than others is being portrayed as the system, the bourgeoisie, the elites versus the have-nots, or the working class. It is a way of saying there is a superior and inferiority. And this pisses off the leftists because they identify with these feelings of inferiority, as this is Ted's thesis, identify with these feelings of inferiority, and they want to view themselves as pure. They want to view themselves as virtuous. So when you're presented with cognitive dissonance, you can either resolve your dissonance by bringing in your expectations and aligning them together. So for instance, if you're inferior and you believe you shouldn't be, maybe you accept that you are actually inferior and you get over it. The other way is you double down and then you say, no, I'm inferior and it's your fault because I should be pure and I am pure. My corruption isn't my onus. It isn't my responsibility. My inferiority is your fault. You're to blame, right? So instead, it's a lot easier to then blame the system, and the system just becomes any boogeyman. It can be the Jews under a Nazi regime. It can be the white man under a American regime, or the black man, depending on which side of America you're in, right? So there's always like a black man, which is kind of not the black man. There's always this idea of there's a corrupting force that is infiltrating our purity. And that should be to blame rather than us taking onus of our own lives. And it's just, in terms of science, well, science is one of these forces that is commonly blamed because it represents objectivity. It represents superiority or inferiority. And we don't want that because it violates our conception of widespread purity. That seems to be more or less the contention there. It's just in different cultures, they'll have different things as a boogeyman. If you're rallying against objectivity, then science is an easy target because it promotes objectivity, which unless you're willing to rectify your feelings of inferiority or humility, then science is going to be a target. For instance, with the existential crisis USA had when the world had, Europe and USA had with the difficulty in believing in God, which Nietzsche talked about, right? Science is then saying, hey, you guys need some humility because it's harder to justify the capital G deity called God. And you can double down and you can bring out your pitchforks, or you can have some humility. Because to have that humility, it is then saying, you were inferior and you believe silly things. And are you willing to accept that? And
so
yeah.
I think Sumit was kind of getting at like how he sees like a lot of times that within like the postmodern left or just people, a lot of hard leftists will say that, oh, science and all of these other things are part of the patriarchy and part of the white man's colonialization, and that that this is not something that's appropriate for, or it's something that is just foreign to a lot of the black person's culture, or something like that. But I think that the way that Theodore is using the leftist association to science is just the fact that let me see, the black people is not so the leftist is trying to, well, it's funny because I think the way that he's responding to sort of these leftist activism is sort of different from the way that a lot of African-American activism is taking place right now, where it is the case that leftists are making the case that science is anti-black, and so trying to teach black people science is just not part of their culture. And I don't know, the way that he's sort of articulating is seemingly that the leftists are trying to socialize black people so that they're in the same sort of system as everyone else.
But the wrestling here is that paradox that I wrestled with for a while, and then I came up with that summation. Like, it is very difficult because he presents a lot, and I think like at least those first five would have been better if he presented it through a fiction. For instance, like Rand presents her philosophy with her original fictions, right? Because it's kind of like doing a personality profile. And again, you have this thing where he's accusing them of many different things, and then justifying the reasons, right? So there's this idea of inferiority, but we can't believe in inferiority because of our over-socialization, right? So we can't say but we hate inferiority. Like, that's the thing. We can't stand it. And we hate our own role in it. We hate our own being in it. We don't want it. We have a fear of being inferiority. This is why it's so important to prove that a Black man can be validated as a doctor or in the white system, or a woman can be validated as a CEO, because that would prove that they are strong like men are strong, or they are strong like the white man is strong, that they are no longer weak. But the whole problem that is arising there is this over-socializing. They could just be socialized less to not care as much, right? And for instance, like for the thing, like, so what? Like, you could just accept it. You don't have to have this issue of inferiority. But this is the thing. It's the driving for people to be like them. It's the reason why people high on agreeableness often go into journalism, because if something, the best way to make people like me is to have people agree with me. And the best way to have people agree with me is by giving them the same information as me, or the same thoughts as me, and then they will be like me. Because it's a belief that it can't be genetic differences, because if it is genetic differences, then it all falls apart, because there's nothing that can be done about inferiority unless we do genetic modifications, which he is very concerned leftists will then go towards to eliminate inferiority. And so there's this tie-in where the leftist is using technology to validate the inferior, or to convert the inferior as superior, as the image of superiority, as themselves, to be, what's the word? Like the way that like the man-made God is, where it's just like, if I am God, then I make man in my image, right? So if the leftist is God, I make man, or, who I can control in my image. So that way I am right. So they talk about, for instance, they proclaim that it's about moral relativity, right? But if it's about, if it is all relative, then it doesn't matter at all whether there is Black professors or women staying at home, right? So why is this paradox? And it's not actually about moral relativity, it's about validation.
I have a fear that we're sort of going off the rails a little bit. I feel like we should probably make this a little bit more concise and easy to follow for.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. This is the first 5 pages here is the foundation that he's supposed to rest off. So with this, right? So if we just run with that, because again, he's gone off the rails. He's an extremist, right? So if we run with that, so why is this such an issue, right? And why is he rallying against leftism? Well, one is, he's concerned that of their overarching authority, but he's also concerned, he's looking into, well, why is there this? Why is over-socialization that tends towards inferiority, that tends towards an authoritarian nature? So how do we solve this over-socialization? And anarchy is always the pitch for how do we solve over-socialization. And he goes into this. This is the connecting dot, right? The power process is connecting dot. So what is the power process? And the power process, which he elucidates, is comprised of several different things. And he goes into it a lot. But pretty much it is, the power process has 4 elements. The 3 most clear-cut of these we call goal, effort, and attainment of goal. And the last is autonomy. And all right, non-attainment important in goals results in death if the goals are physical necessities, and if frustration if non-attainment of the goals is compatible with survival. So, okay, so a goal is something that is meaningful, is significant, that is comprised of goal, effort. The power process is a process that comprises of a goal, effort, attainment of goal, and autonomy. If you have those things, you feel satiated in life. However, a technological society has made comfort, has made effort, acquiring the necessities of life too easy. In which case, we are deprived of a power process in our life. So then we fill it with a surrogate activity, or in the later half of the book, he calls it an artificial activity. So what is a surrogate activity? And he portrays it as anything which, if you were to not do, you wouldn't feel as if you missed out. So for instance, like say, or more specifically, if you weren't to do, it would affect your survival. But then he goes a lot into the minutiae or the nuance of this, because for instance, many things like getting a job, like a meaningless desk job or a meaningless factory job, to some extent, that is a necessity because it pays the bill, otherwise you will starve, but then it doesn't offer fulfillment. And again, this is why modern business over the last 30 years has gone directly into providing a power process for employees, so they don't feel like cogs in a machine. So then, and there is, he then goes into next chapter as the source of social problems. Well, actually, he goes into autonomy, which is the other aspect, which he kind of says there is some people have a high need of autonomy, some people don't. And he talks, for instance, about like, instances of different people going about this. Let's just see if I have any notes that are worth saying. Okay, but you'll see I start highlighting things in blue, and blue is when I disagree with things. Okay, so one of the aspects here is, thus it is not surprising that modern society is full of surrogates. So, okay, in modern industrial society, only minimal effort is necessary to satisfy one's need. Thus, it is not surprising modern society is full of surrogate activities. So, for instance, this includes scientific work, athletic achievement, humanitarian work, artistic and literary creation, climbing the corporate ladder, acquisition of money and material goods, far beyond the point at which they cease to give any additional physical satisfaction, and social activism, where it addresses issues that are not important for the activist personally, as in the case of white activists who work for the rights of non-minorities. These, right? And then these are not always pure, because they may actually provide necessary sustenance in terms of monetary resources. But he's rallying with this incredible arrogance that was very reminiscent of myself back in 2014, before I radically challenged my own beliefs. That, for instance, I was a tech worker and I was like, is making coffee apps so rich people can get the coffee quicker really something that is benefiting society? Am I solving the poverty that I was so concerned about? And the answer was no. So then I decided, well, fuck it, let's live without money for a while, because I've done the rat race thing and that seems to be problematic. Let's try to live without money, right? And I went down this whole pathway, which I've documented in other links. But I would go through pages like Product Hunt, and I'll just be like, this is meaningless, this is worthless, this isn't solving any real problems. And to some extent, there was the movie Free Solo with Alex Honnold. He climbed Yosemite free soloing without any protective equipment. And it's like, woohoo, great on you. And he said in the movie, there was a line, something like, I do this because I feel as if I'm doing something important or something like that. But then you can easily retaliate and it'll be like, whose life does it solve? Like, who are you actually benefiting by doing this? It just seems like wank. It seems the same thing Ted is protesting against. Like, you can't climb walls or like, do mountain climbing to achieve survival. Therefore, it is a surrogate activity. You're making this artificial goal to then obtain the power process. And he's rallying against these type of things in the same way he's rallying against, for instance, like a treadmill. We today, to maintain fitness, to make our bodies feel satiated, we run on the spot or we run around in circles, right? When before we would achieve that through hunting, right? So this is a surrogate activity to maintain satiation. Video games would be the modern equivalent of this, right? And he then talks about how different people have different needs for autonomy. Another person could then become a cog in a machine, like the military would be another example that he raises. So we have this issue where modern technology, because of its ease of access of necessity, is now filling our lives with surrogate activities that don't necessitate survival. Therefore, we should increase the difficulty of attaining survival, so we are maintaining a real power process rather than a fake one. And it's hard because this level of arrogance, and this is why I started highlighting things in blue, is because, for instance, when I watched the Alex Honnold thing, I was like, man, he's in for a big cognitive dissonance blow, in the same way that Linus Torvalds was in a big cognitive dissonance blow. And he did a video from Linus Tech Tips or Linus Media Group. He did a video of I'm thinking about retiring, in which case he says he's having like an existential crisis or had one. He's not sure whether making YouTube videos for connecting advertisers to people is actually something good for humanity. But in the end, he's decided, fuck it, I'm going to do it because I enjoy it, right? And so it's the same type of dissonance. Like he's realized, is this a surrogate activity? How am I going to resolve the dissonance? Is this solving things that I really care about? And he's like, well, no, but I enjoy it. Fuck it, I'm going to do what I enjoy. And what I've come for the same thing of when I watched Free Solo, and I was like, Alex is in for a slam fist of cognitive dissonance, is because later on I realized he's actually benefiting the world quite dramatically. One, you could say through inspiration, but more specifically, I watched a lot about North Face, the company in the North Face, and also just fashion in general. I watched a lot of things about fashion, and fashion does seem like, hey, it's just conspicuous consumption. But when it comes to sports fashion, for instance, I'm wearing this jumper. I recently got a bunch of winter clothes, and that's why I was researching, because I was tired of being cold. Now, one of the things about extreme athletes is companies like North Face, Patagonia, or whatever, they work, especially North Face, is they work directly with extreme athletes to develop and fund clothing technology that is superior. It is the Tesla of clothing. So for instance, you partner with the rich people, you develop superior technology, you then scale it through economies of scale to where everyone can afford it. So it's the same thing for clothing. For instance, with Polar Tech or North Face's Futurelight technology, things like this. They utilize, so Futurelight, they use nanospinning polyester technology to allow whether the threads are nanometers long. So that way, or micrometers, whatever it is, very, very small, right? Like you can't do it with hands anymore. You can't even see them by hands, right? Where it prevents water from getting in because water is too large, but allows air and vapor to go through. So you get waterproof, but superior lightness, superior breathability. And they partner with these extreme athletes to test and develop this. So what these athletes are doing is actually providing the initial investment of superior clothing that then trickles its way down to everybody. And then some of the things I learned through this time of living moneyless and challenging these things was I was hitchhiking all through Australia, and you meet everyone in Australia and you're forced to get along with them because you have to have a conversation in the middle of the outback for several hours and not piss them off, right? So otherwise you're stranded. So what you need to do is you need to get along with a wide breadth of people. And one of the biggest takeaways I got from that was, holy shit, Australia's economy is comprised from all sorts of things I never even realized or comprehended. And they're all playing their part in making sure Australia runs smoothly. And then I realized, like, it's the same thing. When we enjoy our freedoms, it is because our military protects those freedoms. When we enjoy electricity on the internet, is because a government and private sectors and all sorts of things are protecting the flow of electricity and the flow of infrastructure. So there's this whole, that's when he trickles into this arrogance projection that
I think that
fuels.
I don't know. It seems like those two, what you just brought up there reminded me of the difference between a fragile system and a robust system, where a fragile system has many different sort of like crucial components to it that if this shuts down, the whole thing just fucks up and gets broken down in it. But if you have a robust system, you can have, not discrepancies, but yeah, I guess sort of discrepancies. Like you can have points of failure, but that doesn't shut down the entire thing. It's robust enough that it can withstand certain elements of failure. And I think his point in the paper is that our technological society is becoming more and more fragile rather than being robust, because like the very fact that you have a jacket is reliant upon like how many other different like companies that are specializing in just this one thing, like creating a nylon fabric, and then another that's putting it together, another that's focusing on like what the weather durability, and that's just for a jacket. The fact that like you can't go to one person and have them fix the jacket is and like we're kind of seeing quite a bit of this with Corona right now, that like a lot of the corporations and the companies that were heavily reliant upon other countries and distribution between these things, as soon as something like that, something like Corona that kind of puts an embargo on these types of transactions taking place, really kind of puts a damper on the whole plans of being able to act upon this. And so that's what makes it, that's why it breaks. That's what makes it a fragile system.
Right. To add into that point, so this is another area I've got highlighted in blue later on. So page 26, he's got the bit, it will be easier to destroy the industrial system on a worldwide basis if the world economy is so unified that its breakdown in any one major nation will lead to its breakdown in all industrial nations. However, this isn't true. This is a few of his assumptions here aren't true. So for instance, such interdependence or such, interdependence is different from codependence, right? Now, and a global economy is also, maybe to an extent it's codependent, but to an extent it's probably more interdependent than it is than codependent to an extent, because it also provides incredible resiliency. So for instance, like say Tesla having factories all around the world, gigafactories. If China goes down, or there's import duty wars, like economy wars with China, what are all the tech companies doing now? They're moving the factories, distributing them now to India. They're investing billions of dollars in setting up these factories in India. Or in say Tesla, they're setting one up in Germany, one in China, one in India. They're targeting like all the continents, and to some extent, this is actually a benefit of import duties. What an import duty is designed to do is artificially drive up the cost to then force the hand of the company to build a national infrastructure to supply that technology. So for instance, Australia charges like $40,000 or something on importing a Tesla, right? A huge amount of money. But the goal is to have Tesla build a factory in Australia. And then that way it becomes a local good. And therefore it doesn't have the import duties. So this is something where as it progresses, he's got some assertions that if he just waited a little bit longer or wasn't as radicalized so early on, he would be able to use science to challenge his assertions rather than to just use them to make his assertions. And the way that I would say to introduce that idea is he talks about how large systems or that anarchy is the environmental solution. And to some extent, this is true. Elinor Ostrom's work has shown that overregulation does, like the tragedy of the commons, which proclaims that anarchy destroys the environment, is actually a myth. And that what happens is if you allow self-emergent regulation, it actually works out quite well, providing a few principles end up also developing. Because if you have public property, then there's no owner of the land, therefore it is exploited to the highest bidder, or the person who can get away with it. But if you provide ownership, then people have protection, a need to protect. And if you provide cooperative ownership in the way that a self-emergent thing will work, such as a coalition of farmers, they actually work on a dual emergent enforcement. This is actually what the leftists are meaning when they say dismantle the police force. They're not actually saying eradicate the police force. They're saying get away with the tyrannical authoritarian version and then go back into local forms of policing. Apparently there was one state or one of several municipals in the USA that has done such a thing where they've moved away from more tyrannical police enforcement towards more community police enforcement, and it has worked out very well. That's what they're actually meaning. Of course, when you extrapolate that across the breadth of intelligence that protesters have, you hear the loud, crude, and crass interpretations of that rather than the original nugget of truth, right? So the point here is things like Elon Musk is a great example of the counter argument towards this essay in the works he's doing with Tesla, with Neuralink, with OpenAI, in democratizing technology to spread its benefits to everyone. And extrapolate the power process out, or the way that agile development methods or revised development methods have operated in technology. It's not to say we don't are at risk of huge power and technocracy, but with the role of crypto and the largest transfer of wealth to libertarians ever with the rise of Bitcoin.
I'm not sure how I follow that Elon Musk's contributions can aid in the satisfaction of the power process, given that Elon's like providing a greater technological resource for people to make many things less effortful in order to go through.
Right.
Which, part of the power process is the exertion of effort so that it feels meaningful, that you're doing something important.
Yeah,
because otherwise, if you did like had everything come at you just on a whim, then it loses its sort of value to you.
Right. Yeah. So the power process, it's for it to feel meaningful, but his rally against or for it as well, the necessary requirement he projects onto the power process is also that it is meaningful. Not just that it feels meaningful, but that it is actually meaningful. And this is why he's rallying against a lot of busy work, right? Which was very much filled with the 90s corporate jobs, right? Like Office Space is a great example of that, right? Or many different works where you could, many comedies along this category of movies, right? So then we go into, okay, so we have these feelings of inferiority and this over-socialization. This arises because technology has deprived people of the power process, which leaves them feeling inferior. And therefore, we need to give people back a power process. And there's two ways we can do that. So one way is we find a way to balance or integrate a power process back into a technical society. Or two, we remove the technological threats to a meaningful and power process, right? So, for instance, when I was hitchhiking, I didn't bring any technology. I had my phone to listen to music or podcasts, or whatever. But working as an engineer, I didn't have a laptop. For 6 months, I lived without a laptop. And really without the internet while I hitchhiked around Australia. And I found peace. I was pretty much like a monk at that point. I didn't feel any needs. I was very much the mindfulness Eckhart Tolle embodiment. Because when you're spending multiple days at the side of the road in the middle of the outback, 500 kilometers from the nearest town, you generally develop a sense of peace, right? So on one extent though, and you also realize like, well, why is it? Because every single thing I do is significant to my survival. It's meaningful to my survival. It's the same thing like, say, when I moved initially before the hitchhiking, I went from being a software engineer to volunteering at a soup kitchen. And that was way more meaningful. Why? Because I was actually delivering something people need that sustains them through social interaction of smiles. And I was there for them. It was donation-based, right? It was a soup kitchen. So people there, your job was to make them feel welcome. And your job was to provide sustenance to them, to sit down with them, have conversations and do those things. And that was far more meaningful than just working on betting software or coffee software for some bourgeoisie, right? And it's interesting because he even rallies actually against the service industry later in the work, because he feels that these are artificial, because then it is depriving people from satiating their own hunger through their own acquisition of food, through their own agriculture or hunter-gathering. So he really wants to drive people into a primitive existence as much as possible. And this is unfortunate, because then we have, say, someone like Elon Musk, who through specifically not so much Tesla or SpaceX, but I will cover SpaceX more, or actually all his work, his life's mission, right, is to eliminate the existential threats to the human race, not just to a human, but to the human race. And we have OpenAI. They've now got an artificial general intelligence that they are now deploying initially privately, but then hopefully with their original intended goal was publicly to the world. And this is something which, in my opinion, is as important as literacy in democratizing cognition. So for instance, with literacy, we now have this huge democratization of cognition. Now, for instance, rather than it just being the elites or the intelligent, now we have this technology of literacy that we can write and communicate more and think more clearly than we ever could before, trying to hold everything in our RAM, that people have different capacities. We can write things down, we can create to-do lists, we can talk across generations. When an artificial general intelligence, say, for instance, with programming, one of the demos OpenAI did was, everyone may be familiar with Terminal. It's that very scary thing which has a little blinking cursor, and you type things that could nuke your computer or automate tasks on your computer, right? Like your sudo or your God mode to a computer, always the thing which the hackers in the movies are interacting with, right? Now, before to do that, you needed to know a scripting language, most commonly Bash, right? These are specialized skills. And now that acquiring that specialized skill for the sake of acquiring it, well, that's a subjugate activity. That's an artificial activity. But if you attach that with a goal, an intention, a higher purpose, then suddenly that just becomes a stepping stone, a journey along to something meaningful. So what OpenAI have done is they've made it so you can now type in a terminal and then say, count the amount of files in this directory, or tell me what files in this directory have the most lines of code, or have the most lines. Or for instance, they even use it to automate programs. But what they've done is now you don't need to know a specialized skill anymore to interact with a computer system. Instead, you can speak English to it and it fills in the gap. You can speak your intention and it fills in the gap. You can do the same thing for spreadsheets. You can say, hey, give me the amount of clothing that I have that is rated 5-star in warmth that I spent more than $100 on. And it would generate the query to give you that result, right? So this does, to some extent, it's like a calculator in the way that calculator democratized maths. The ability of, you no longer needed to know how to do multiplication in your head. Now you could just type it into a calculator. So OpenAI are doing that, but then we have Neuralink. So for instance, Neuralink, they're initially targeting restoring people's cognitive deficiencies. For the paraplegic, they could correct the misfiring neurons. And this is another thing where we don't have to be ruled by technology. We can actually find a balance and work with it. So we have that, but then another aspect to Mr. Musk is SpaceX, which is this desire to become a spacefaring civilization. Why? Because science is the only thing that can save us, or spacefaring, which is brought by science, is the only thing that can save us through the existential threats that nature provides. Asteroids, volcanoes, hurricanes, global warming, or even man-made ones, the nuclear bomb, right? Because, and this is something which he does go into later.
Several of those are also the byproduct of the application of science, though.
Right. Well, an asteroid certainly isn't.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. Yeah, so some is. So some is the thing. So we'll go into that, because this is, I just want to introduce like my not dissonance, my where I consider his connections go off the rails. All right. All right. So now we'll see a lot more blue. All right. So what was my thing? Okay. His thing here is the conservatives are full. They whine about the decay of traditional values, yet they enthusiastically support technological process and economic growth. Apparently, it never occurs to them that you can't make rapid, drastic changes in technology and the economy of a society without causing rapid changes in all other aspects of society as well, and such that rapid changes inevitably break down traditional values. So it's like, well, you're not a real conservative unless you're also a Luddite like me. That's kind of my little comment there.
Well, it's sort of like him critiquing their own inherent values. Yeah. Like they want to support traditional values, but yet they hold to policies that would result in the deconstruction of those values. All right.
Right. All right. So okay, let's get into some of these claims of his connecting force to his solution. Right. So. There is a good reason to believe that primitive man suffered from less stress and frustration and was better satisfied with his way of life than modern man is. It does appear that, generally speaking, the kinds of problems that we have listed in the preceding paragraph were far less common among primitive peoples than they were in modern society. This is social problems or whatever. But one of the issues here is they did have tribal warfare. They had huge issues of scarcity. And not just of scarcity, but of natural oppression. For instance, women were tied to the role of, or the constraints of periods of what's the scientific word for period? Menstruation.
Yeah.
Right, which spread disease if not using menstrual pads, because before menstrual pads, they use rags or they self-isolated to prevent spread of disease. It was shame-induced, and shame is a cultural socializer to prevent undesirable actions or consequences. And we had things like disease, plagues. Now, obviously, some plagues were the result of socialization, where a tribe wasn't immune, and then they were introduced to a new disease. However, that's not always the case. And that will always be the case because that is part of natural oppression. For instance, with SARS or with whatever disease it is, a lot of these come from animals, so it's just a freak of nature. It's there and now it's oppressing us in the same way a volcano explodes. And unless we want to eliminate all trade and go back to the Bushido ethic of the samurai of complete self-dependence, then the risk of infiltration by naturalistic oppressors of disease is there. Because as long as we're engaging in trade, we risk being infected by their foreign invaders. And we also haven't yet solved the issue of natural causes of death, such as volcanoes, asteroids, hurricanes, things like that. And for instance, he really starts to start rallying into this nature fantasy, something that Peterson has critiqued quite heavily, where nature is this benevolent mother rather than something that is also absolutely horrible. And this is interesting as well, because where did he go to the woods? He went to the woods in America. And America, for the most part, is quite a benevolent country to go into the woods in. That is why it's amassed as one of the most powerful things, because it's resource rich. It's not environmentally that oppressive compared to areas where you have, for instance, Siberia, the far north, or instances where you have desert, or you have Australia, for instance. Like in Australia, we have 40,000 years of independence of the indigenous Australians, the Aboriginals, right? And they amassed technologically rural, primitive agriculture. They did have agriculture. It was quite primitive, and sticks and throwing things. Now, this is fine. But my statement here is when the first settlers, the British settlers near where I grew up, there's an island, or there's in Albany, we have a little monument, a little stone. And there's an inscription from one of the quotes from one of the early settlers or people who arrived there. And they were like, Australia could only be thought of by hell. the wood is not good for anything. There is no water. There is nothing. All it is good for is to die, or something like that, right? And it's interesting because where you have a wealth of resources, but also significant challenge, you get incredible benefit, because you could say, well, the equatorial regions have a wealth of benefit, free providing fruit, but then you also have catastrophic challenges of monthly cyclones and hurricanes and tsunamis that every year obliterates everything you built. So therefore you're at the wrath of this ethic of where you are reactionary to nature, but you're always in the state of survival. And this is also why Filipinos, they are like the happiest people you could ever meet, except every year they have to rebuild because the terrible cyclones, like they get like something like 100 natural disasters a year or something like that. Like it's insane. But yet they're happy, but they're not materialistic. But then you have things like the far north of the world, or even the far south, where unless you prepare for the winter to come, you will die a horrible death. And so it's very hard. But then you also have roles of disease and all these other things in the equatorial regions that kill you. Mosquitoes, for instance, where it's cold, mosquitoes generally aren't a threat because they die off, right? So we have this relationship with nature where it is benevolent, but also problematic. And he doesn't seem to, he rallies for this tying in to this meaningful relationship with nature, but at the same time, he also misses, and this is where I feel his self-awareness dies off the rails and he goes into the megalomania of radicalization, is because he doesn't realize, and this is the thing with Brave New World, this is the thing with 1984, especially Brave New World. We did a discussion. It was one of the first books we read on Bevry. What was the solution to that? Initially, back as a tech worker who hasn't really studied philosophy, I was like, hell yeah, Brave New World, this sounds awesome. Like, I get all the pussy I want whenever I want, and whenever I'm unhappy, there's a drug to solve all my problems. I get, it's just fantastic. Like, why wouldn't anyone want this, right? Yeah. And everyone's happy all the time. And if they're not happy, well, they're sober. But then the thing is, well, this is the matrix. At any point in time, there's this issue of, is this the most I can do? Is this what is real? Is this what I was cut out for? And in the Matrix series, you have this issue where Cypher decides to kill his teammates to make a deal with the architect to then provide endless hedonism for himself. But at the same time in the Matrix, you had people who naturally came out of the Matrix, who realized this was a game and who came out. And Neo was someone who suspected, but he had assistance. He followed the white rabbit. He took the red pill, right? So in Brave New World, we had the discussion of, well, and actually this is fascinating. We had the founder of the Stormtroopers, not Stormtroopers, the Daily Stormer, right? He spent his life, there's a fantastic interview with him by Sargon of Akkad, one of the only people who would actually argue with him, because the left are terrifying of having their worldview challenged. But he lived in Philippines, in a tribe in the Philippines for several years, and he forgoed everything. He did something very similar than what I was evaluating at the time, which is going to the nomads, like the Mongolian nomads, an area where you completely reduce your terrorism on nature and you use nature to feel fulfilled. But after a few years, he realized, I am wasting my potential. And this is horrifying. It's the same thing for me. Like, if I was to work at a restaurant, I will have a nagging belief in me, I'm wasting my potential. I'm something real. Like, what happens? Like, and this is the other thing. Like, the reason why we developed a society to defend us from nature is because at any time, the unknown, a dragon, which is a naturalistic force, or humanistic force, right, can strip away everything we found comfortable. right? And this is, again, why we developed agriculture, because hunting and gathering was too prone to naturalistic effects, or, for instance, genetic engineering of foods. These are all done to prevent the afflictions that nature has on us. So what I'm positing that his lack of self-awareness is he fails to realize that primitive life is a subjugate activity. It is a artificial reality. It is one which is it's just like a video game, because at any time you can opt out and you can scale your efforts to where they are more meaningful. And if you like, so for instance, someone who grew up in the Philippines, right? To some extent, like the reason why the monetary currency of different countries differs. For instance, in Philippines, I was watching a brilliant documentary series where they went through all different areas of the world, looking at the lives of truck drivers, and they would generally be paid like a few dollars a day or a few dollars a month or whatever it is to do these grueling activities. Now, the reason why is a currency, the valuation of a currency is the collective value that that country offers. And that collective value is also embedded in the philosophy and the education and the progress individuals are embedded with through cultural inheritance or societal inheritance. For instance, a American has a much more developed education than someone in poverty in Africa or Asia would, right? Even if you have, you know, issues with American, you still are provided an education. You're not sold off to prostitution when you were 8 or into marriage for a dowry. You are not, you know, things are horrible. Even in Russia, like the lower class, the have not and the have divides, it is terrifying, this thing. But the point here is that one of the hard things of, for instance, why, let's say, Indian programmers, if Sumit's still listening, we've talked about this before, where it's like one of the reasons why Indian programmers are paid less than Western programmers is because certain traits of cognition and philosophy that are beneficial to objectivity and programming kind of built into an upbringing. So for instance, if you're exposed to a computer at the age of 8 versus being exposed to a computer at the age of 30, you have a much different relationship and with technology. And it's going to be a lot harder to play catch up. So this is in part these differences. So what is this generational quest that those in poverty have? It's to make the life of the next generation better by amassing wealth, by amassing power, by participating in this power process. And this is always to try and provide more comfort with less extension of resources. Now, if you were there to then go as the privileged white guy and do the white savior mode and then go into these primitive societies, right? They will wonder why you're there. They will wonder, why are you not in America sending money back home or building a school and teaching them these skills, right? Why are you wasting your potential? It's the same type of pressure that the families of the Chinese and the Indians have, and the Japanese, which is the youth have tremendous pressure to participate in bourgeoisie, in the power process, to then fend off terrible tragedies for their grandparents and their extended family. So it's kind of unfortunate because he's got this like right-leaning, like right anarchical vibe, which is that if you are weak, no one should be there to make you stronger. It's your own fault and you should fend for yourself. And yet that's not the motivational force we have when we have children. We have children and a community to make each other stronger. So this is, so for instance, he talks about issues with crowding, where technology fuels crowding. But why does it fuel crowding? Well, it fuels crowding because people want to participate in this power process, this wealth process, and because it makes collaboration easier. There is benefits to this side. And this is always going to be the case. Like, this is why I say that anarchism is self-cannibalistic. It eats itself at its first enforcement, because for him to maintain this anarchical, this power process, this independence power process, he needs to enforce it. And he enforces this by an authoritarian system. He has to impose his system of anarchy onto others, in which case it's no longer anarchy. He's doing all these traits of projecting inferiority onto others and then exerting himself as the protective force to protect them through the oppressor.
So it seemed like there was kind of two things there, well, there's plenty of things there, but I mean, as the major points of critique of him that you were pointing out. One, that the even living out in the wilderness, or like living on a farm or something, you know, sort of like very much like how it was, I don't know, several hundred or 1,000 years ago, the primitive sort of lifestyle would be still a sort of surrogate attempt at undergoing the power process. Is that kind of like what you're?
Well, it's only a surrogate process if you have the potential to go beyond it. So, for instance, the peasantry in China, it is the most meaningful thing they can do, right? However, if you have the capacity to be a doctor and you don't, this is why that is such a shameful thing to do in those cultures. Or to be an engineer and you don't. It is because you are now condemning that multi-generational effort into continued poverty. And that is why it is has such terror and imposition, and why, again, people will then, it's not a feeling of inferiority, it's like a feeling of, like I call it the superhero syndrome, because often through the left, we have the imposter syndrome, right? Which of this feeling of inadequacy, I don't actually deserve this privilege. I am so guilty because I have this privilege, right? And I don't feel like I deserve it. I don't have the skills. But then on the other hand, you have the superhero syndrome. I have a tremendous amount of capacity for change, and I am choosing not to use it, right? And I am choosing, and this is like the Superman complex, like every single thing. He's like, should I use my powers for good? Should I use them for bad? At what time should I interfere? Like, it's the same thing. We have like a moral dilemma with savages, which is, to what extent do we have a moral right to infiltrate savage societies to rid them of barbaric practices? Now, it's not to say that they're all barbaric, but you know, many different things. But for instance, pedophilia or domestic abuse, these age of consent is something that requires, to some extent, a concept of society there. But if you're in a world where menial tasks, low-skilled labor is the foundation or the necessity of life, then you want to pump out as many children as possible, because because the sooner that they turn 5 or 10 or whatever it is, then they're now participating economically and they protect you from devastation, right? Whereas in the West, let's put them in 20 years of school for a job that may not even be around, right? Because we have now used minimum wage to eliminate any menial jobs. And this is very different because, for instance, I just watched a documentary last night called Purna. Purna is an 11-year-old girl in India who climbed Mount Everest. Wow. Now, that's interesting because she came from a family of incredible poverty. Her cousin was married for a dowry. In Western terminology, we would use sold, but this is because of extreme poverty. You get a girl, you sell them for a dowry. You get a guy, they work, right? You don't have time to care about education. You have time to try and not starve to death. So her sister was was impregnated with twins and died in pregnancy at the age of 13 or something. And at 11, she goes into a school, and fortunately through, again, a Indian who studied at Harvard and then decided to bring some concepts into India to then say, hey, incentives should be aligned with progress. All the teachers now you are going to be paid according to the progress of the students, right? So therefore, they all got their act together, and this girl had a natural ability for climbing, and she was selected along with another boy called Anand to climb Mount Everest, and they did. And this became an inspiration. Now the enrollment on welfare schools went from 8,000 seats of the possible 10,000 to now 60,000 seats of the possible 10, right? And these are tremendous forces. And this is where, to some extent, one of the other criticisms I have of him is he suffers from Americanisms. He's free to talk, and I don't actually blame him for this, because this is pre-internet. This is pre-global consciousness, right? A lot of the issues he talks about are inherent with an American society, rightly so. But if he was to grow up or spend more time overseas, such as the founder of the Daily Stormer did, he would have a very different consideration of what he is proposing, I feel. I'm going to take a quick break. I'll let you riff for a little bit. I'll be back in like a minute. I'll still be listening though.
Okay, yeah. All right, well, I will have to probably head out in like 30 minutes, then with a bit of leeway, I guess. But let's see. What we might do is, I don't know, since we've gotten through maybe just the first 7 pages or so, we might do another follow-up meeting at some point or something to go into sort of the further things within this as well. There's a couple of arguments that I had just before we started, trying to figure out what are the sort of key points or key sort of like main arguments that, like, if you were to try to boil down the whole thing into something. Yeah.
Well, I do, as I say, like, I found the first 5 pages incredibly profound, but then after that, I think it's smooth sailing, because he hedges everything on the assessment from the first 5 pages, and then he connects things. So I think like 30 minutes or 15 minutes for the rest is fine. Sure. I don't think we need another follow-up.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So I had like a couple arguments, just like conditional statements regarding like kind of the hypotheses of the book. If industrial society shall continue to make humans irrelevant and unhappy, then it would be in the interests of humans to put a stop to industrial society. What's your kind of take on that statement?
Sorry, I didn't realize you were going to direct something at me. I was reading my own notes.
No, yeah, that's right. So if industrial society shall continue to make humans irrelevant and unhappy, then it would be in the interests of humans to put a stop to industrial society.
Or to find a way to obtain happiness and the power process within it. And this is where I think his radicalization while he was in the woods is in large part because he's, and again, this is like, I just wish he waited like 10 years for the internet, right? Like just a little bit, because this is like many different things. And we know this from like the Bevry Manifesto itself on our discussion of collaborative wisdom. Like first you start off in isolated wisdom, and then you get into competitive wisdom, and then finally get in collaborative. But always this transfiction, like when we first discovered Peterson, a lot of the time we're like, oh my God, he's saying things we've known or we've related to for so long, and now he's articulating it. There's always this feeling where unless you have humility, you feel threatened because someone else is discussing something. But while you're in isolated, you feel like you're the only one having these thoughts, right? And this is hard because he deliberately went into the woods, like he cut himself off. And it's hard because if he waited a bit longer, like he has a lamb blasting about, a crowd, like crowds will, hold up. He's got several things where it's like, okay, it is well known that crowding increases stress and aggression, but that's only to the degree that agency is dwindled, right? Like there's always these little hedges of nuance to the crude assessments he's made. And these are things which if he could have made his purpose, like if you say with the internet, he rallies against technology as this thing that isolates people away from community and family. And yet we have things like Twitch, and we have things like YouTube and the relationship with PewDiePie and Reddit or Discord.
That just seems
or
like
Bevry.
support of his argument, because these are
no.
that are separating people still from their inner communities, and you're having these parasocial relationships that are forming between.
Well, not necessarily, because for instance, as a I'll give an instance of as an Australian, I grew up in Perth as a someone who had this natural ability for tech. Yet if I went to a tech meetup in Perth, and the only tech meetup, and it was 20 people, and it wasn't just it was one meetup for all of web development, right? Mm-hmm. And then I went to Sydney, and then suddenly it's a meetup for every single different programming language, and the JavaScript one has 200 attendees. Now, if I then go to America, it's 400 attendees at New York. New York has the population of Australia pretty much, the greater New York, right? And these are the things if so you can grow up with a isolated isolated abilities, and the internet connects us. And this is why people throw themselves into these internet celebrity. Now, this is not to say there aren't inherent issues with this, but this is a major divide. If he was able to use the internet, he would be able to connect these ideas with more people without having to kill people to get on primetime television, right? And to go down in the history books. He could start a YouTube channel, right? He could do other things to connect, because the internet connects people. They connect people based on interests, right? And then that can also allow people to find. So for instance, one of the issues that is facing Australia in regards to marriage or relationships is this gender divide. For instance, many men around the 50s or 60s are divorcing or marrying Asian women. And this is something that I actually is brilliant, because say we have Tiesto, and Tiesto is 50 and he just married a 20-year-old supermodel. And we see this all through the elite class, which is men compete for access to reproduction. And reproduction is in fertility between the ages of 20 and 25 or whatever, right? Ideally, because if you marry or you do that wealth. But in Asia, in Chinese cinema, this is just obvious. Your whole job is to acquire wealth, to marry someone younger than you, to have as many children as possible, depending on the one-child policy, things like that. But that's the point. You want to acquire the wealth of productive value with the wealth of reproductive value, right? And do that as a matching. But what happens, though, is if, as a male, you may have many limited opportunities in your own social area, in which case then this is going to be abused if there's any leftist journalists listening into this, right? Which is then you can always...
Earlier you were saying the N-word quite regularly. So.
Yeah, but this is going to be a great headline, right? Okay. You can always acquire women from countries where your wealth is more appreciated. So for instance, Indonesia, many Australians live in Indonesia, especially miners. They do fly in, fly out. They live 2 weeks in Australia in the mines, and then they live in Bali or somewhere else in Indonesia. And Indonesian women are trying to match themselves with that wealth that the white man provides, right? And this, they play into these things like love is, the idea of romance is a pragma. And it's interesting, there's the color, the wheel of love. It's like a Wikipedia thing that goes into the Greek versions. But one of the aspects of love is pragma, which is to what extent to you is love based on pragmatism. These are one of the aspects, right? And different cultures have different interpretations. For instance, if you're listening to Western music, you're probably high on eros, right? Which is this feeling of lustful love, right? But many in Asia, it's very high on pragma. And also storage is another one. Storage is a love that develops from a friendship, right?
Storge. Yeah.
So we have these things where it's, so my point here is the just like trade does, and the internet has so I'll introduce another issue I have with him. Where does he draw the line? Is the blacksmith not primitive? What about when we watch Primitive Technology, the YouTube channel, in his quest to improve from primitive technology? He goes from clay and sticks towards a bow and arrow, towards a hut that is made from furnace clay that is now heat and water resistant, right? Like he developed himself up. But what about a blacksmith? When you develop a hammer, is that now industrial technology? To what extent does trade benefit versus take away from us? And these are things which I wish he did, because like he waited a bit longer, because I don't think he would have felt so alone if he had the internet. I think a lot of his feelings of inferiority and isolation would have been resolved if he waited a little bit longer.
Right. I think I recall like his separation between what types of, because like everything's technology. The very fact that you're wearing clothes is a technology of a sort.
Right.
And he's not just going up against technology in general, but the fact the industrial technological system that is in play, and the like basis that he has to sort of separate the two is like, what is something that could be developed just on its own, or like without having to rely upon an entire system at work in order to do so. So in order to create an iPhone, well, first you have to have some sort of communications with China, right? And you have to have some factory that's all set up just to create the circuit board. And then you have to have another one that's working on diodes, and another that's actually working on programming, all these differing sort of systems, all just to make one simple phone. That's something that obviously requires an entire system at play. And he brings up, as an example, just a refrigerator. Like in order to have a refrigerator, you have to have copper tubing. You have to have something that's extracting gas in order to all these different systems that are all necessary at play just to keep food at a certain temperature so that it doesn't spoil. When prior to the refrigerator, all we did was salt meats so that we didn't have to keep it in the refrigerator. And in fact, now a lot of human diet is kind of doesn't get enough salt in their diet, funnily enough, due to the refrigerator. So that's kind of the difference between, like, for the primitive technology thing, even if all of the stuff that he was using before, he would know how to rebuild it, and he could teach somebody how to rebuild it, different things like that. It's not like he has to rely upon 20 different other people, or I don't know, even something like that would be fine, because it's part of a, what is it? It's not the Dunning-Kruger, but the Dunbar's number of like how many people can you interact with and as part of your tribe. He doesn't bring that up at all, but it seems like that's what his kind of basis is, of like returning to some sort of like small town or tribal sort of scenarios without having to rely upon this like broader system where like you're interacting with strangers that you've never met before in order to just get something as basic as human needs.
So one example of this, like some examples he uses a refrigerator later, but earlier on he says power mowers, radios, motorcycles. If the use of these devices is unrestricted, people who will want peace and quiet are frustrated by the noise. If their use is restricted, people who use the devices are frustrated by the regulations. But if these machines had never been invented, there would have been no conflict and no frustration generated by them. And I've got the little thing. Ted says, no toys for you. The gods must be crazy. So this is a documentary. You share. Google Chrome. Okay, The Gods Must Be Crazy, 1980. So in this one, it's an African tribe, primitive tribe, and a Coca-Cola bottle lands in the tribe from an airplane, and now scarcity is introduced. And they have conflict presented from that scarcity, and one of the tribe members volunteers to return the Coke bottle to the god that created it. And then he goes on his way back to the tribe. And it's interesting, like this is the frustrated parent to his projected children in the case of Ted, where it's just like, you two are fighting over scarcity. No more scarcity for you. I'm taking it away.
Well, the point he's bringing up is that there's sort of this catch-22 situation where, because there's this valuable resource to, like, people love to motorbike, they love it, And then there's the other valuable resources. Oh, people love peace and quiet. But the fact that you have both of these situations together, one of them is going to frustrate the other. And so because we have this invention, there's going to be some sort of frustration, just inevitable in association with it.
Right. And this is something which like the self-governance lane of anarchism seeks to solve, right? But the truth there is in self-governance, which is, let's just get all the motorcyclists to live together, right? Or to be. And this is actually, again, like with high bandwidth internet connection, we can now do this. Now our work is separated. Americans have finally realized this, thank whoop, that our work is separated from the office. We can work from home for a lot of industry. What does this allow? It allows us to socialize with communities which we align with rather than be stuck within the factory of Google, right? Or whatever it is. And so this is great. The motorcyclists can be together, yet they can work and separate themselves away. But then you also have the extent of, well, is the work a artificial activity? Well, it depends. Do they consider it meaningful? And this is, again, where I find for him, like, instead of resolving his dissonance where he's frustrated by not being able to live as a primitive person because the system is always wearing him down, I think some of this frustration is what's the word? Displaced from his again, those feelings of inferiority or the lack of anomy. He uses the word anomic earlier in it, where it's like this ill-fitting to society. But again, with modern technology, we have this kind of like hyper localized community force where people can radicalize into their own interests. But at the other extent, like for any problem like this, we are on the cusp of incredible frustration and incredible pain. And then we have a emergent breadth of people coming up with a solution. And we come up with a solution. And his thing, it's so weird because his thing is a regression. It's the same thing where Dave Rubin introduced the idea of the regressive left, which is his thing is, well, let's just regress to when what I consider to be a good point is the way it is for everyone. But he doesn't accurately acknowledge the threats that were, or the pain that was there. He's utopianized it. And I explained that with, the earlier things that people in poverty are actually fighting tooth and nail to overcome through multi-generational efforts. And the other thing is, he lambasted against science as a artificial thing. But again, it's like, well, yeah, the activity of staring at a computer screen, that's bloody boring. But we don't stare at a computer screen for the sake of staring at a computer screen. Often, people who have found a balance and found meaning, like say, such as what Vervaeke and Peterson try and do, is they're staring at a computer screen for a meaning that is there. And the same thing for Purna. When she climbed Everest, before she was allowed to, they asked her, what is your reason for climbing Everest? And she didn't have one. And she wrestled with the challenges and obstacles that came her way, because otherwise it would be a subjugate activity. It would be an artificial goal, right? But then she came and she said, no, I'm going to climb Everest because people like my cousin deserve something to accelerate themselves beyond the constraints of their environment. And, these are things. It's like the same thing I work with Bevry is because when I watch a documentary like The City of Ghosts, which is about ISIS radicalization in Raqqa, then I see people who have had isolated wisdom and competitive wisdom drive themselves into extreme forms of, I guess, artificial meaning and decay, where the potential isn't actually realized in a transcendent way. And this is hard. It's the same thing for the white supremacists or the black supremacists or ISIS or whatever ideology there is. It's always like this regression to where it's like, I have all the answers. I will now impose against those who I consider inferior, this self-righteousness. And it's really hard because instead you can always extend a helping hand and help people rather than always pointing a gun at them. And it's yeah.
Well, there's still an aspect of that imposition upon the individual that's taking place within a technologically industrial society anyways, because like the very fact I have a cell phone is because it's necessary for my job and in order to just live within society. And like that's something completely new, and now it's something that like I haven't been trained for how to deal with this at all.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is brilliant, right? So for instance, he's used technology to write and disseminate this message. He's used technology to create bombs, right? And mail them, right? In the targets. He's used technology several times. I'm going to say when he lived in the woods, he didn't do it primitive technology style. I'm going to say maybe he brought a few pieces of technology along the way, right? And this is one of the things which is why is it? And he goes into this in detail with the revolutionaries. The reason why you must eject the left from your revolutionary cause is because you have to have your revolutionary cause focused on the goal at hand, focused on the meaning that you want to achieve. And for his thing, it is the eradication of industrial technology factors or contributors, right? So he's willing to use technology to eradicate technology, right? And that's his whole sole focus, because if you introduce, in his words, leftism further, then you introduce fragmentation of cause, and then you accept technology without the desire to get rid of it. It becomes a cooperative force. But at the same time, he didn't realize just then what he did was he then attributed a higher meaning towards his use, right? And this is the thing. If you can take that exact same process, which is a subjugate activity, or, you know, depending on the qualification, but that process, that power process, you can attach that power process to many different things. And he talks about that with subjugate activities like video games and things. But in his way, he's considered meaningful because of this higher purpose and the manifesto and all of this, right? But at the same time, you can be like Elon Musk and then say, I'm going to use science and use technology to make sure humans don't get extinguished by an asteroid. That seems like a good idea, right? Which case, hey, that's meaningful. That's something significant. That's something that overcomes a threat that his thing only regresses towards being exterminated by again.
Right. Yeah, so, and that's kind of this thing for me is I'm quite doubtful as to like how it's even feasible to regress back out past this point. It's like the beast has been let out of its cage, and now we have to do what we can to appease it, even if it does mean that like we're stuck living this sort of like menial lifestyle because it produces the means for which we can, I don't know, continue living, I guess.
Right. All right. Well, let's coalesce this into a great summary in the last 10 minutes. And what I'll say is, there's another, what was the resource I was just going to mention? So a few of the things, just like for that, like say for our iPhone, like I bought myself an iPhone 4 many years ago. And the iPhone 4 is this piddly little thing. It's hardly addictive. It's just, you know, whatever. Like you're never going to get addicted from something so small and tedious, right? But then I upgraded to the iPhone 6S Plus 5 years later because I finally felt it was a necessity because my iPhone 4 was like falling apart. And this is after my my hitchhiking and everything in 2016. I think I upgraded, and I got addicted in a big way. Suddenly, YouTube is engaging. Suddenly, it's enticing. Suddenly, media is at your hand at any time, right? And it provides this addictive force. And even like at times, like I've had this huge addictive draw towards things like YouTube, where before developing defenses against it, I could easily spend like 8 hours a day watching YouTube in the same way that many people back in the 90s had addiction towards television, right? But for this, it's Cal Newport wrote a series of fantastic work. The first one is, I can't remember what the first one is, but the ones that are related are deep work, and then his next one, digital minimalism. And deep work is all about, again, a power process, developing meaningful work and going back into this primitive power process, but applying it to modern technology, finding a balance here. And then digital minimalism is like a how-to guide on how to build defenses against these technological threats, how to build a defense against the series of behavioral analysis that Facebook and Google deploy, right? And it will be things like deliberately making things like YouTube a bit more annoying, deliberately putting in defenses, deliberately unsubscribing from everyone, deliberately, doing things to make your intention return. And finally, iOS 14, the one that's coming out in a few months, brings widgets to the home screen. So no more does your home screen have to be a bombardment of conflating appeals for your attention, but it can actually be something that returns control back and the agency back to the user. You can have your home screen now be your to-do list. Woohoo! No longer is my home screen in a thing of a dozen different apps. So these are things where, but we have this, like youth now, they're more conservative, but they also have more mental illness issues as well. The suicide gap between teenage girls and teenage boys is actually closing. Teenage girls are being a lot more effective in killing themselves now. And this is concerning, but teenage girls are also incredibly susceptible to the damage that is caused by a unlimitedly sized social group. Because how do you judge your value when your value as an early woman places a lot of biological emphasis on your physicality? And even for a guy, now we're comparing ourselves to Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, and before it was like Bill Gates. Like, that's depressing.
And people like Chris Pratt from the MCU and all the muscular, handsome actors and things like that. Yeah. Right.
When before, like, it was very important to realize, like, your wife, like, there was maybe like 3 or like maybe, you could even be in a society where there isn't any women who are available. And this is a common issue actually with primitive societies. With polyamorous societies, the strong got the woman, you're out if you are weak. And then that caused intragender. The society was plagued with intragender competition. And that is not conducive of developing society and developing cooperation. So arranged marriage is actually a fantastic solution to that. Everyone gets a wife. Now the genders can cooperate. There is intragender cooperation. The men can now cooperate with each other rather than compete. But one of the issues that men face, for instance, is, hey, I can marry, and then, for instance, hey, there is always a new girl who is presenting herself as a possible siren towards my appeals, right? It's an unlimited selection base. And this is why women have a traumatic, as well, like self-esteem issue, and that's something which is a defense of marriage that now needs to be deployed, which is to realize my social pool of selection is not every single girl on Instagram and Facebook or YouTube. My social pool of selection is actually the girls or the men who I've actually interacted with. And for women, for instance, with Tinder, you can sleep with, what happens is like the top 20% of men get access to 80% of the women, right? And then the bottom 80% of the men now compete for the bottom 20% of the women. But this is terrible. This is the intergender competition that is not conducive, because it puts everything again to a surrogate activity of sex power. But it's the thing here is it's damaging, because then a woman can sleep with a top tier man and then confuse that with marriage access to the top tier man, wealth access to the top tier man. So these are, when in reality, the male's program that he is deploying there is fertility in as many women as possible, which is a fantastic thing. And that's what Hollywood is filled of. Elon Musk, he's got how many kids now from different marriages? Like, if you're a top tier man, as many children as possible from as many marriages as possible is a highly successful strategy, as well as for Genghis Khan, who is like the best father out of all of history in terms of propagation. So these are issues where it's like, well, what we do there is we find ways to have a primitive power process in relation to modern technology, because we will always have technology solve the issues of tyranny while creating its own problems. So, for instance, one of the issues is if he had access to the big red button, he would have pressed it.
No, he wouldn't.
The nuclear button. I'm pretty sure he would.
To exterminate all life on Earth?
Not exterminate, just to restore things to primitiveness. You have a dark cloud for a very long time.
Yeah, probably.
I think he would have pressed it.
That's a different red button than I'm thinking of. The red button I'm thinking of is the one that exterminates all life on Earth, which could also be.
I'm not talking about that one. I'm talking about like one that would just cause like a nuclear winter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I'm talking about an atomic bomb red button. Not
so this is one of the questions I was thinking of. Is it immoral to shoot? I wrote it down. Let me see if I can find the exact phrasing of it. Sorry. I'm trying to find the exact. I wrote it on the margins and it's all written in highlighter. Anyway, the basic point of it was like, is it immoral to impose a sort of system onto people such that they won't have the ability to be happy? Or is it immoral to impose other impositions onto people so that they could be happy? Because that's the thing, is like his central finding, I guess, in his work is that this type of a society is not one in which people can flourish under. It's something that it's just going to legitimately, like, people don't have autonomy under this system, and they're not experiencing the power process.
Right.
So to put them into a situation where like it would require a vast revolution in order to allow for people to exist within that power process again. But yeah, that's his thesis.
Yeah. Well, so I'm just rushing through my notes here, right? So we've got here. So like sometimes he does have a little profound insight along with the dubious nature of the rest. Mm-hmm. So imagine a society that subjects people to conditions that make them terribly unhappy, then gives them drugs to take away their unhappiness. Science fiction, it is already becoming to some extent in our own society. It is well known that the state of clinical depression has been greatly increasing in recent decades. The amount of what Americans on antidepressants and antipsychotic drugs is what double-digit percentages. It's really high. And this is interesting where, there is a point of this, which is anomy is a real thing. And it is something where, to an extent, you have to get the person to adapt. But then, you have this issue of imposition. But with what you stated, it's again his projection of inferiority, his own inferiority onto everybody else, because he can't adapt. He concludes no one else can adapt, and that because he can't find a real meaning in his activities in a technological society, he concludes no one else can either. And this is the agreeable fallacy, because I feel this, everyone else feels this. Because I experience this, everyone else experiences this. With a disagreeable person, like, you have no conception that other people feel the same. And that's part of why they lack empathy.
Well, isn't that a legitimate move then on his part? If he's one of the margins of society that society is just not going to be able to facilitate, that he has a right to reject that society and to try to shape it so that it will facilitate him.
Yeah, so this is your typical...
Joker. Sorry.
It's also your typical privilege battle. He specifically rallies against the bourgeoisie, right? And this is it's interesting, right? Because he's rallying against, and this is something earlier, which is You have the privilege which society and the system of society supports. And then you have the unprivileged or the marginalized who are pushed to the margins, who find it traumatic to live within the constraints of the society, right? But all systems, and anarchy is a system, as much as they want to pretend it isn't, will suffer from this. So for instance, I don't think I actually need to qualify that. I think we probably have. Let me just blast through my conclusions. Okay, wait. So he's got another quote here. Since there is no reason to suppose that more modern men than primitive men have innate predatory tendencies, the high crime rate of our society must be due to the pressures that modern conditions put on people, to which many cannot or will not adjust. This is just patently false. But I've got the little note here. Well, why not test if any of these proclamations are true as a social scientist? Oh, wait, it is because we believe you testing your assertions is an artificial existence. And this is because it's an artificial activity. Like the social sciences he rallies against because he believes it's an artificial existence. All right, not true. Okay. But, okay, so one of the counter arguments to this, besides the embodiment of Elon Musk, is a book called Waking Up in Time by, let me share my screen. Waking Up in Time, Finding Inner Peace in Times of Accelerating Change by Peter Russell. I read this after my hitchhiking experiment, and this really helped me dramatically. I was very concerned about the environment. I had very similar angst as he was feeling. And I tested it and I was like, okay, shit, living moneyless incurs many problems. And how can I rectify this? And this book was incredibly helpful for that. He talks a lot about the history of such, of naturalistic issues or technological issues over time. All right, arrogance, you talk about, okay. Like, human beings were kept busy. I've talked about Neuralink and everything before. Yeah. So a lot of the issues I think he raises, I think the correct answer, the response is so what? And I know, and that is also something which like the left hates when the privileged says it, right? This is like, oh, like, so for instance, he campaigns against the economy and he's like, well, the economy pushes the useless out. But the response is, so what, right? And, the other alternative is you try and fix this problem. And you can fix that problem by economic engineering, by all sorts of things that introduce things. Or you can go back at it from a values perspective. So some of his few things, they're not real problems. I feel they are certainly a problem, but they're not a problem which actually deserves a solution. And you have this all the time in business. For instance, in business, you have to discriminate over which problems to solve. And many problems just aren't solving because there are more important problems to solve that solve things or deprecate the need for a problem. So for instance, should we completely change the economy to protect the useless? Or should we allow charities to fill in that gap, right? Should we dramatically, steal away people's agency and income, or shall we allow the free market or whatever it is, to fill in these gaps, these instances? So one of the areas he was also profound, I'm so sorry, John.
That's fine.
Is for this reason, the revolutionary should not try to acquire political power until the system has gotten itself into such a mess that any hardships will be seen as resulting from the failures of the industrial system itself and not from the policies of the revolutionaries. Look at the comment here. Currently in the USA, both parties can be viewed by the other as doubling down, even though both are doubling down in defense of the other. So this is interesting. So we can think of this in the USA right now. 2016 election, we had Trump. We expected, I'm not even sure why I'm using we here, right? Maybe it's just this agreeable thing, right? USA had Trump. And what many of the Trump supporters considered was, hey, this will finally be a humility, a humbling moment for the left. Maybe they will finally realize regressive left isn't catering towards the needs of half the USA population. Maybe they'll realize half the population aren't racist, and maybe they have sincere issues, right? Maybe they thought that Clinton wouldn't solve those issues and Trump may solve them better, or Clinton raises others. But no, instead, half the population is, instead the thing was, we never realized how many Americans were racist. We never realized how bad the problem was. So I was thinking about this for the current election year coming up, or the current election. If Trump won again, right? Well, the thing is like the two sides in the USA, you have to, let's say, I'm just going to say the left and the right, even though I don't think that's actually accurate at all over modern whatever, but we can say, well, the right would want to vote in Trump because they're concerned that the left will double down. And the left has the exact same perspective, because they want to get in whoever isn't Trump, because they view the right as doubling down. It's really interesting. So we have a situation where they're both doubling down in defense of the fear that the other is doubling down. Yeah. So a few of the things, he's got great insights, but just he needed to get into collaborative wisdom instead of radicalizing. It's really unfortunate. Yeah. But maybe after this, we should do the Christchurch Manifesto, because I heard a teenager recently be like, we should just kill all the white supremacists. And I was just like, well, what are you going to, what about the black supremacists? Do you then allow them to kill you? And she's like, well, maybe we should, and then didn't really have it. I was like, well, maybe read the Christchurch Manifesto and develop some counter arguments. Rather than suppressing it and allowing everyone to radicalize, there's actually arguments against it. And, you know, with Bevry, we've come to find out a lot of these arguments that hopefully we can help prevent these radicalizations. So for instance, another quote in here he's got is, and you can see some of the stuff that was quite entertaining to me. During the later pages, he starts capitalizing things more and more and getting a little bit more impassioned. Which is funny. But modern individuals and small groups of individuals have far less power than primitive man ever did. Well, no, you can boycott things. You have a tremendous amount of power. It's interesting.
Like,
well, what do you mean?
Like there's a large group boycotting Chick-fil-A right now, but Chick-fil-A is still like doing as good as ever, really.
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
Like, how is that any sort of semblance of power for the individual doing the boycotting?
Yeah. Well, because your money is now no longer supporting the thing which you disagree with. This is incredibly important. Your money is now moving towards things you do agree with. This is a whole idea of investment. It's even the reason why the stock market exists.
There's still no effect in the world that's happened.
No.
The point of a boycott is so that this thing will die, but it's not dying. So the boycott is useless.
Well, the only idea of a boycott is that it will die would be if it's this authoritarian fringe, right? Which is that my way is the ultimate way. So for instance, with veganism is a boycott against animal cruelty, right? Mm-hmm. So they vote without it. But if you are going to maintain an authoritarian, what's the word? Disposure towards veganism, you will end up with all the psychological issues he talked about, because you are now believing that your way is ultimate and you are projecting it onto everyone else. And because people are inferior, they can't protect themselves from the big booty man of animal cruelty, right? But instead, you practice a little bit more compassion and you realize that for many people, the cost of adopting veganism is too costly for them. They could, for instance, one of my best friends, he developed a psychological degenerative disease where he had to sleep all the time. And it's very depressing. And he had to use animal protein because it was the only way to help his digestive system not go into starvation mode, because animal protein takes longer to digest than plant protein. right? On all sorts of things, like to promote veganism to a Filipino who a pig at the annual birthday or marriage is one of the first times they have complete nutrition is cruel. So you have these things where, or even in the West, where it's like, for many people, like let's say Elon Musk, I don't give a shit whether he's vegan or not, because any decision he makes goes towards veganism is a decision and psychological energy that is taking him away from accomplishing the other benefits he is, right? So it's fine for people who have the privilege to go vegan, but for me to assert it for everybody, then that is me being an authoritarian. And it's not beneficial. So when I boycott, sure, I want animal cruelty to eventually be phased out. However, I don't, and I have this actually as an essay. I have it in a paper doc, one that I wrote, which is what vegans and non-vegans alike don't get about veganism. And I say that veganism is an ideology against necessary animal cruelty. But so for instance, vegetarianism is just a diet avoiding animal products. So for instance, roadkill, or let's say lab-grown meat, it isn't vegetarian, but it is vegan. Why? Because there was no animal that was harmed in the process, so there's no cruelty. So therefore it's vegan. So, but one of the things which all vegans have to do is they have to, or converted vegans, born again vegans, whatever you terminology you want to do, is you have to admit that you were a killer. You paid for people to kill on your behalf and torture and abuse and whatever conglomerations you want to add to that mix. That is hard, emotionally hard to deal with. And you can either retort against that with massive rage against the system that forced that impurity upon you, that necessity to hurt, or even that ignorance to hurt, right? You can react in rage, or you can do it where it's like, use it as a tremendous amount of humility and say, I didn't know, this is a process of transcendence for myself. And there is many people where I wouldn't want to wish the curse or veganism upon them if they do not have the means to do so. This is why many religions have a prayer before they slaughter to say, bless me, like, forgive me, God, for I have sinned by taking this animal's life by, killing, in order to protect myself against starvation, right? Please bless me and bless this animal, and have peace be upon its soul and peace be upon my family, right? Those are what many prayers and many religions amount to, right? And this is good. This is ways of resolving the dissonance without becoming radicalized. But the goal, again, it's not to, blow up all the animal, all the abattoirs, because that would induce more harm. The goal is to boycott, slowly ease it out, right? And that's power. Like for me, that power is returned to me. I am part of the power process by boycotting. My conscience can be clean that I did not pay or procure something that participate. Now, of course, there's way more complicated things. Like, for instance, pharmaceuticals, they are generally made with lactose because it is a great solvent, I guess is the word, for maintaining the medical integrity of the drug. But the lactose is a byproduct of the cheese industry. But it's a byproduct, otherwise it would be thrown away. The typical result of that would be to flush into rivers, and then you have a huge issue. So instead it's used. Is that necessary animal cruelty? No, right? So, but I have power, and this ways of restoring power in the same way we can, set up, Sundays, we don't use technology or whatever it is. We can restore the power process to ourselves. And Elon Musk, we can use technology to democratize technology for all, such as Neuralink or OpenAI. Let's just pray to God or Elon Musk or whoever it is that OpenAI won't go the typical VC route, which it seems to be doing, and keep that technology to the highest bidder. Let's just hope they actually do achieve.
What does VC stand for?
Venture capitalist route.
Okay.
They've been doing a series of things that provide a little bit of skepticism. So let's just hope they are nice. But if they're not nice, the system does its thing. It has a revolution. It's great. When there is tyranny, we solve it. Isn't it fantastic? Um,
I don't
Yeah,
know. You're starting to sound like an extremist all of a sudden.
yeah.
All right.
I mean, like, yeah. Alrighty. Thanks so much, John. Really appreciate it. I hope I hope listening to me was enjoyable because I know you didn't get to talk that much. But before we had the call, I think I had a lot more to say that you were keen to hear.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I'll probably be listening over to this over again at some point, so that'll be good.
Alrighty, great. All right, so this was part of the Bevry community. We're working with doing these things as part of our study initiative, which is Solve for Humility to facilitate collaborative wisdom. We can read more about our manifesto at bevry.me, and we're also working on products to help facilitate, working on technology to help facilitate collaborative wisdom because it is such a meaningful thing to work on. And next week, maybe we'll figure it out, but it'll be something probably similar to this. Thanks so much, John, for joining me, and good work, John, on the Bevry Reading channel, which will be uploading readings of different papers, and we'll even have products to launch around that as well. It'll be really nice. Everyone can participate openly with our community at the links below in the description. Thanks so much, John, and thanks everyone for participating. I'm going to end the stream now, and let's see if I can do it correctly. I'm just waiting for the one on YouTube to catch up. There we go. Good. All right. End stream. Yeah. Stop share. Yeah. And